So a little background on myself. Before I was running Scalar Capital, I was an early employee at Coinbase. So I started there doing blockchain investigations, working with law enforcement and regulators, catching cyber criminals. The Bitcoin blockchain is very traceable, so I'll talk about that later. And then I later switched to be product manager for internal tools, and then left a few months ago, started a crypto fund, full-time investing in different crypto assets that we think are really promising long-term. So you might have heard the term cryptocurrency and crypto asset. Just want to give some background. So cryptocurrency is essentially a decentralized digital currency. This currency is not issued by a centralized entity like a government or anything. No one controls this. And then the word crypto assets started being developed in the community because it started extending beyond money. It started extending to different representations of real world assets like gold and real estate, to equity, stocks, bonds. So that's why people started using the term crypto assets, and generally going to be using that term going forward. Something that I think is really important to know is that so Bitcoin was the first cryptocurrency out there, but there's this wave of other crypto assets. So there's 1,500 right now just on CoinMarketCap, but there's actually thousands more. Anyone can create one. You can actually just go to Token Factory and just issue your own token. You just name the token, you change the parameters, the supply, and you can just issue it. So early days of Bitcoin, it was pretty much copycats of Bitcoin or other currencies that were just trying to be another payment system. So it's just being a digital currency. But we started seeing this wave of different tokens and assets once Ethereum came along. So in 2016, Ethereum started gaining some traction. I'll talk about what Ethereum is, but just know that the important trend is that Bitcoin's dominance as the major crypto asset out there is actually decreasing over time as more and more crypto assets start getting developed. So Bitcoin is essentially, like I mentioned, digital money. So you can just think of it as a simple transaction. You send from Alice to Bob. There's no centralized entities that's dictating that now Alice owns this now and Bob owns this now. You essentially just have a decentralized network that's verifying this. The founder is Satoshi Nakamoto. No one knows who Satoshi is, which I think is really interesting. There's been a number of people that have claimed they're Satoshi, but none have been able to prove it. The release date was January 2009, and the way that Bitcoin's released is through mining, which is essentially you have hardware that's solving and competing for earning Bitcoin through solving these complex mathematical problems. That's a very, very crude way of saying what they're doing. Mining's a little more complicated than that, but for now I'll just say that's what it is. In the early days of Bitcoin, you could actually mine through just your computer. Anyone could just access this and become a miner, but over time, competition got really intense, and you ended up having specialized hardware that mines Bitcoin. And so it went from just anyone can access this to now like these intense mining farms. Many of them are based in China or places that have access to really cheap electricity. And so these hardware that are specialized are called application-specific integrated circuits, ASICs, and they're fairly expensive, very, very intensive on electricity consumption. They get really overheated. Like I was mining Bitcoin in my room one time, and it was just so overheated, like I had to move it outside. So just it's not something that's just regularly accessible anymore. And Ethereum came along in July 2015. Something that was really interesting was they essentially just released this proposal that this group wanted to start something called Ethereum, and they wanted to make it so that they felt Bitcoin didn't have enough programming logic that you can build in. They wanted to kind of make it so that there was more that you can build on top of Ethereum than what Bitcoin was able to do. So they wanted to make the language Turing complete, so you can essentially program anything on it. And they just released this proposal and did a crowd sale and ended up saying, like, please donate in exchange for this. We'll actually give you some Ether. So they raised $18 million in Bitcoin. The founder is known, and that's a fairly big difference. So Vitalik Buterin is one of the main founders, and then there's a number of other people that co-founded with him. So what Ethereum is it's a smart contracts platform. So what smart contracts are, essentially, you can think of it as digital money, but programmable. So in my example with Bitcoin, you can see send from Alice to Bob. But in Ethereum land, you can send from Alice to Bob upon certain conditions happening. And this is really powerful because you can start automating away a lot of processes that middle middleman ended up getting a bunch of fees for just transferring from one person to another upon some certain event happening. So Ethereum itself is the platform. There's this wave of Ethereum tokens, and the way that you can think about tokens is they're just digital assets that are being built on top of Ethereum. So like I mentioned, anyone can create a token. This token can represent anything as well. So sometimes people think it might just be money, but actually it extends beyond anything. You can tokenize anything you want, like you can tokenize your backpack or something and put it on the blockchain and you can sell it. People are doing all kinds of crazy things right now. Actually, the vast majority of tokens are complete scams right now, just letting you know. But the way that this is typically issued to the public is through crowd sales. So a team will generate all these tokens at once. They'll say, we're making, and this is flexible, they'll say, we're making $1 billion, or we're making 1 billion tokens, we're making 1 trillion tokens. We're actually going to sell half of this to the public, and for this specific exchange rate. Sometimes if you're really early, they'll say, we'll give you a discount of 20 to 30% or something like that. But they'll sell to the public for an exchange rate, usually take the funds, use that to develop the project. Some of them don't even develop the project, so be careful. There's no like strict guidelines on how they're supposed to use this fund. And so then they'll usually retain some of the tokens for themselves, and now they've distributed their tokens to the public. Something that I think is really interesting, so a particular token is called REP. So Augur, this prediction markets platform, created a token called Reputation, and people refer to it as REP. Essentially, they are creating a decentralized prediction markets platform, so anyone in the world can create a prediction market. And this is very different than past prediction markets, because in the past, you had centralized prediction markets where this centralized entity kind of dictated what gets added to this prediction markets platform. And so you end up only having specific like sports betting or specific like political events. But in Augur, anyone can create anything. So you can just create some prediction market betting a very specific event just between you and a few other people. So this allows anyone to be part of the network. The interesting problem in Augur is that when you have a decentralized prediction market, you don't have a centralized entity that's now saying, oh, here's the outcome of this event that happened. So you now have to find some decentralized source to really feed you this data and say this was actually who won the election, or this is actually was actually the price of Ethereum on this specific day. So what Augur does is they did a crowd sale, they distributed their tokens, and now token holders of REP are obligated to report on the outcome of prediction markets. So they're randomly selected to report on the outcome of various events that happen. And these token holders are actually incentivized to tell the truth, because they hold REP themselves. If they lie and start to try to like sabotage this network, they're actually punished because they own REP themselves. And so you end up having a system where Augur is not going to actually be valuable if everyone's just lying on the platform. So everyone's incentivized to be truthful and try to make Augur more valuable itself. And Augur also has a system where you can punish bad behavior. So if the rest of the group is actually reporting on the outcome correctly and you're reporting incorrectly, you actually lose some of your money. So it's a really interesting system, but all of the tokens out there have very different dynamics, and I highly recommend kind of looking into some of the tokens out there. To talk a little bit about Litecoin, I think Litecoin is important to know. It's essentially a copy of Bitcoin. It was created by Charlie Lee in 2011. Charlie Lee is around, and he's a well-known figure. He worked at Coinbase. So this is really interesting because he just took Bitcoin, copied it, and changed a few parameters. So he changed the total supply. He also changed how fast transactions get confirmed. So when I mentioned that mining in Bitcoin ended up getting really competitive and only people with specialized hardware could mine Bitcoin, he actually thought this wasn't ideal because he wanted everyone to be able to participate in the network. And so he ended up he changed the algorithm so that it was more memory intensive, so it was harder to have specialized hardware actually win in these competitions. So he changed a bunch of parameters, but I think the most important aspect about Litecoin is that it's basically Bitcoin, but with a founder actually known and able to kind of rally the community and have them all be supportive of the same vision. Charlie's actually flown to China to kind of like negotiate with some of the miners. Like he's very involved in the community, and I think that it's an interesting experiment to kind of see what Bitcoin would have been like if Satoshi had been around. So something else I'm going to talk about is so as I mentioned at Coinbase, I was tracing Bitcoin. Bitcoin actually is extremely transparent. Every single transaction that happens on Bitcoin is displayed on a public ledger called the blockchain. So you can actually see all Bitcoin balances. You can see every single transaction that's happened. You can see the addresses that were involved in the transaction amounts. If you think about this and compare this to the real world, you don't actually have an equivalent. Like every time you spend something on your credit card, you don't broadcast it for the entire world to see. So this is something where a lot of people in the community don't necessarily feel comfortable with. There's also this wave of companies that are specifically trying to de-anonymize the Bitcoin network. So some of the more popular ones are Chainalysis and Elliptic, Blockseer. They're actually taking all this data, doing data analytics and kind of using public information like court documents or something. They're taking this data and tagging Bitcoin addresses, and so they can kind of see money movement. And they're working with exchanges, law enforcement, regulators, and even crypto funds to kind of try to tell people what's actually happening on the network. This is kind of scary. You essentially have maybe law enforcement's using this data to catch bad people, which is a good thing, but keep in mind this data is also available to everyone. So you could have bad actors actually target good people and kind of see their balances and everything. So there's been a lot of privacy coins out there that kind of focus on hiding this data and pretty much acting the same way as Bitcoin and being a store of value and being a payment system, but just obfuscating this information. And so with Monero, which is one of the oldest ones, it's been around since April 2014, they're just solely focusing on privacy and trying to just hide this information. Another really popular privacy coin right now is called Zcash. It's a very similar kind of concept, just uses very different technology than Monero. Zcash uses something called ZK snarks, which is essentially zero knowledge proofs. So zero knowledge proofs just mean that you can prove a transaction happened or you can prove something happened without having to reveal any information about it. And that's really powerful because you can essentially extend this beyond just money, and you can start proving, for example, that someone lives in a certain place without having to reveal their exact location. So this is a really interesting technology that's been built pretty recently. And so Zcash has really pioneered using that in cryptocurrency. Something that's pretty unique about Zcash right now is that they also have mining. Monero has mining, Bitcoin has mining, but they actually have something called a founder's reward, which essentially takes a percentage of all the mining rewards in the early days of Zcash to compensate the developers for all their work on it. And this is just a different model than what a lot of the other currencies have done in the past. They kind of just release it to the public. And so Zcash is kind of trying to see how they can incentivize developers. So those are kind of the more popular coins out there. And I want to leave time for questions because I think there's going to be some good questions on crypto assets out there. But to talk about some resources, I write a bunch of blog posts on different crypto assets. I covered all the ones that I mentioned there and a number of other ones. If you're just brand new to the blockchain space, there's a good blog post getting started with Bitcoin, blockchains, and crypto assets. It kind of just takes you from like just day one to getting more advanced. Cryptoassets is my favorite book out there. It's by Chris Berninsky and Jack Tatar. It talks about just the history of crypto assets, why they're valuable for society. It's not just purely speculative. And I made these slides before this came out, but Andreessen Horowitz just published Crypto Canon, which is this master reading list of all things crypto, and I highly recommend checking it out. My favorite newsletters. Newsletters are really important in the space. The space changes so quickly. Every single day there's just so much news. So newsletters are a really great way of just aggregating all this information. Token Economy is definitely my favorite newsletter. It takes the top news in the industry and then adds some commentary on it. Week in Ethereum News is also really great for following specifically the Ethereum space. I think Ethereum has one of the strongest communities out there. There's a lot of developers that are actively working on projects. Proof of Work is a really good newsletter. It takes Eric's favorite top 20 projects and has them give weekly updates, so you can kind of follow these projects over time. Favorite podcast is Unchained by Laura Shin. And then there's tons of meetups in the space. I'm one of the organizers for the SF Ethereum Developers Meetup, so we bring in different developers to talk about their projects. And then there's one here in Silicon Valley, Ethereum Meetup. And there's meetups for all kinds of other different coins. It's not just Ethereum, so I recommend checking those out as well. But yeah, that's just very high level what crypto assets are and some of the more popular ones out there. The market cap of these are pretty substantial. It's at $450 million right now and $1 billion right now. And essentially, you're going to end up having, I think it's going to just grow over time. So it's worth paying attention to. Yeah, so just leave time for questions.
Cool. Yeah, so question for you. Do you see any value in the future for some of these ERC20 tokens that are coming out that lack kind of that proprietary technology that you'll see on some of these more innovative coins?
I think some ERC20 tokens definitely have value. It really depends on what they're trying to build. A lot of them I think are just purely speculative, and most of the coins, you can essentially just replace the ERC20 token with a more liquid coin like Ether and Bitcoin and have it operate the exact same way. So a lot of them don't have value, but something like I mentioned, REP, is a pretty interesting ERC20 token that you can't really replace. And just some background, ERC20 token is essentially this standard interface for how Ethereum tokens operate. And so most tokens that you see out there that are on top of Ethereum follow ERC20. And that's just a way of kind of setting a standard for how they interact with exchanges and different applications. So, cool. Thank you.
Oh, hello? Oh. My name's Alex. I'm an 11-year-old. I was just wondering, over here. So I was just wondering, I knew how back in like the 1950s, money used to be based on gold. What is digital currency based on?
Digital currency is interesting. I mean, it's essentially based on the faith of the network. So you essentially have a decentralized system where everyone's working together to validate the system. I don't view this as any different than just money that has been issued in the past, where you have to rely on the fact that people are going to value it. The interesting thing about digital currency is that the technology itself is really powerful. And so if you can like program all kinds of logic in it, this is actually very useful to plugging into different applications. Whereas like if you use like seashells in the past, like seashells aren't actually inherently useful, whereas technology I think is inherently useful. So, but no like centralized entity is like backing this at all.
Any more questions? Can you hear me? Can you hear me? So, quick question. So I've been doing my own research within crypto or the crypto space.
Oh.
Yeah, I know you're looking this.
I can't see
in the
anything.
crowd. I've been doing my own research like of crypto ever since 2011. I knew about Bitcoin back in 2008. Kind of dismissed the idea at the time because it was being used by a lot of illegal transactions between people. So it kind of shied me and I could guess a lot of people away at the time. But ever since the value of the individual protocol, Bitcoin and coins started to come up, everybody's afraid of either retraction or a crash in the market. And going to a bunch of other crypto events, advisors within the crypto space were stating that the crash can happen and it is imminent within the next 2 or so years just due to regulations. And other advisors are stating it's not regulations that are going to cause the crash, but more of mass adoption. Do you agree with that?
I mean, I definitely think things are in a bubble right now because there's a number of projects out there that are worth billions of dollars that don't even have a product out there. They just have a white paper, literally just typed up a document, and now they're worth a few billion. So we're in a bubble. I do think that it's very similar to the .com bubble where you have a lot of projects that aren't really, companies that aren't really doing much and adding much value, but then you also have things like Amazon that come out of it. So I think that you're going to have a few crypto assets that are going to be really valuable to society. Right now it looks like Bitcoin and Ethereum are in the lead. But for things that can really cause the bubble to burst, I mean, there's a lot of different aspects. I think that regulation will absolutely play a huge factor in it. Right now, these tokens that are being issued to the public, vast majority of them kind of appear like an unregistered securities offering. And so the SEC is actually keeping a really close eye on this and is going to implement regulation in the space. This is actually a good thing. I think that this will remove a lot of the scams that are happening right now. People are getting completely scammed in these markets. The CFTC has also came out and said that they're going to be mindful about this regulation because they realize that the newer generation is really interested in crypto assets. So I think that they're going to take a pretty reasonable approach. I think in other countries, you are going to see some stricter regulation. China has definitely started cracking down on some crypto assets out there. So I think that will be part of what causes the bubble to burst. I think that also usability could be another factor, although my personal view is another thing that's going to pop is the cause of this pop is essentially scalability. Actually, right now, it's not the fact that people don't want to use it. Bitcoin actually is so used right now that the network itself can't actually handle it. So the transaction is extremely clogged, and transaction fees have. In the early days of Bitcoin, people were like, oh, you can send like, a fraction of a penny, or you can send really small micropayments. But in this world right now, so many people are using the network that the transaction fees have actually gone really high. Sometimes it's $30 to $40 a transaction fee. And the reason these transaction fees are so high is that there's so many people that are transacting on the network that you have to pay the miners who are validating your transactions. You have to pay them extra to compensate and try to get ahead of everyone else. So if they see several transactions and one's giving 10 cents transaction fee and others giving $10 and the other is giving $40, they're going to prioritize the $40. So I think that's actually something that's going to really cause some of the bubble to burst, because if this actually gets mainstream adoption, which people are really using this, the networks can't actually handle this yet because the technology isn't there.
Hello. I hear.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So when you decide to invest a token or not, what kind of a general standard you have to consider about a token?
Yeah, I think the most important aspect is, first of all, I ask, is this something anyone would even want to use? A lot of these crypto assets out there sound like completely ridiculous. Like, why would anyone want to own something like this? So that cuts out a lot of projects. The second question I ask is this token necessary? Or can this just be replaced by something more liquid like Bitcoin or Ethereum? And that's also a vast majority of cases, so that cuts things out. And then I then focus more on the technology. So it's really important that the developers are really competent. Most of them are open source code, so you can actually review the code itself. The team is really important to me. It's important what their motivations are for coming into the space. If you're handing them millions of dollars in a raise, they better actually work on this and implement it. But there's a number of teams out there where they've heard blockchain is a really hot space to be in now. You can raise a bunch of money, and they'll just try to raise and kind of write this white paper that sounds great, but then they'll just kind of check out and like go on vacation. Like that actually happens. So team's really important. Another part that's important is the token dynamics and how that actually acts. What's the token supply? What's the inflation rate? For me, distribution of the tokens is important. So there's been some ICOs, the initial coin offerings. They actually, the team retained the majority of the tokens. So this isn't really decentralized. You have a centralized ownership over these tokens, and that's really scary. I mean, there's a number of different factors. Also looking at the governance model, how do you evolve this project over time? Looking at the community. I stay far away from the projects that have this like pump and dump kind of community where they're just trying to pump the price of the coins. That's not beneficial for long-term growth of the project. So a number of different things. Yeah.
Hi, Linda. Hi, Linda. I have a question. So the crypto sector seems to be dominated by 20-year-old male. And what would be your experience and your challenges you face so far?
Yeah, you're right. I definitely early days, I would go to these Bitcoin meetups, and I would often be the only female in the room. So that definitely happens. But over time, there's actually been a lot of women that have come into the space, people of different ages. Like it's definitely become more diverse. Early days, the challenges were just people were surprised I was interested in this, just because they weren't used to seeing someone like me. That's pretty much the challenges. People have been generally very nice in the community, though, and often want to help people learn. So I've had an overall very, very positive experience.
Okay, sorry, can you hear me? Well, my name is Darren. I have a startup in the Catholic Church. I just want to know if you have heard any usage of blockchain in the nonprofit sector and how to alleviate poverty, probably somewhere in Africa, in Asia, or any stories that you have heard?
Yeah, I mean, there's a few projects that are kind of merging blockchain and nonprofit. I think there's BitGive, there's Social Alpha. So their focus is trying to make donating more transparent, because sometimes you donate to a nonprofit and you have no idea what they're actually spending their money on. So in a blockchain, you're very transparent in your transactions. So that exists. And then as far as alleviating poverty, there's BitPesa that's trying to just make it easier for people to send funds from countries like US and send it over to Africa and have lower transaction fees. Because right now, even just sending money over to different countries is pretty costly, and so they're trying to reduce the costs and make it easier to donate kind of situation. But yeah, it definitely needs to be more nonprofits working in this space. I really support that.
Guys, we have time for a couple more questions. So who's on for it? Okay, one here.
Yeah, which project are you most excited about? And I'm sure there's plenty of them, but if you had to just pick one, what's one crypto asset you're excited about for this year?
Well, I'm very bullish on Ethereum, always. Monero, I mean, there's so many, but I guess I would pick Monero is the thing I'm most bullish on. Disclaimer, like our fund invests in Monero, but I really believe that people haven't realized how transparent Bitcoin is, and there's going to be this wave of interest in privacy coins with stricter government controls, people getting phished, attacked. There's arrests and inquiries that are happening by law enforcement. So I think people are going to start moving towards privacy coins, and I think Monero has the strongest tech around privacy right now.
You like Monero over Zcash?
Yeah, one important aspect of Monero over Zcash for me is that Monero actually defaults all transactions to be private, whereas Zcash, you have to opt into privacy. So actually only 20% of transactions in Zcash right now are private, and so you have 80% of the network actually just being as transparent as Bitcoin, and so a lot of this data can reveal information about the private transactions. So I think it's really important if you want fungibility being that every coin is worth the same as every other coin, you have to be private by default.
Oh, hi, right here. I was wondering what your thoughts were about kind of the identity crisis among some cryptocurrencies of whether their value proposition is in fact to be a store of value versus a currency that should be exchanged for goods and services.
Yeah, in the early days, everyone thought Bitcoin was supposed to be a currency, and even in the white paper, it's talking about a cash system. But as I mentioned, so many people have been using this network, and the technology isn't at the point where it scales, that a lot of them kind of had this identity crisis where they realized that they're actually more of a store of value, because if you're going to use Bitcoin for a coffee transaction, you're going to pay $40 transaction fee for $4 cup of coffee. It doesn't make sense. And so the idea is that you would only use this for really, really large transactions, like if you were to buy a house. And then the rest of it you're just storing as value. So a lot of them are having this identity crisis right now, but you're having this wave of like blockchain 3.0 projects that are working on scalability. And so they're doing different consensus mechanisms to kind of make it even faster. Some of them, the trade-off is it's a slightly more centralized, so you're relying on certain nodes to verify, and they kind of have like special privileges. But there's this wave that's realizing that they want to make something that's actually a cash system, and so they're working on solving the scalability issues right now.